Subscribe before the truth disappears. Rain slicked the front steps, turning the porch light into a hazy coin balanced on its edge. Officer Ben Horn came up the walk with the kind of practiced calm that says he's seen everything and doesn't believe it anymore. The call came in 18 minutes earlier, male voice, flat with panic, repeating the same points as if clarity might save a life. Basement, CPR, please hurry. Police department, Horn called, pushing inside. Silence swallowed the foyer. A bowl of potato chips sat open on the kitchen island like a prop abandoned between takes. Then the voice arrived from below, raw, strangled, too loud for a house this size. "Help! Down here!" Basement stairs, low ceiling, the smell of dust and detergent. Horn rounded the final step and found a man on his knees over a woman's motionless body. He was bare-chested, sobbing, counting compressions and bursts, skipping numbers and returning to them like he'd rehearsed the sound of panic more than the method. "How long's she been down?" Horn asked, kneeling to check for breath, for pulse, for anything that could be converted into minutes. 20 maybe," he stammered. "I pulled her up, I tried." "Keep the compressions," Horn said. "EMS is close." The room was wrong. Horn didn't have words for it yet, just a prickle along the back of his neck. The ceiling hovered just over his head. A plastic tote lay on its side, kitty litter smudged into the concrete like chalk from a game no one won. The woman, Amy, had no obvious injuries beyond a faint shadow near her neck, the kind that would look like nothing under warm light and everything under cold. Sirens stitched the silence. EMTs crowded the stairwell and poured into the space, quick and quiet. The man, Jimmy, stumbled back, ripped off what was left of his shirt like a character performing grief for an audience that hadn't arrived yet, then folded into himself on the floor. Less than a minute later, he stood, composed, breathing steady, as if the outburst had been a spell he could cancel. "Let's go upstairs," Horn said gently, guiding him toward the steps. "Give them room." On the main floor, Jimmy moved like he'd memorized the house and suddenly couldn't read it. Hands hovering over surfaces, eyes catching on nothing. He passed the kitchen, paused, and with no witness but the hum of the refrigerator, slid his open palm across the bowl of chips and sent it skittering. It was a small act, the kind of tantrum a toddler might have, except this man was 37 years old and his wife was below them, unbreathing. Back in the basement, a voice cracked the air. "We've got something," an EMT called. "Faint." Horn heard Jimmy inhale, like someone waking from a dream they preferred to the day. Instead of relief, something like irritation flashed across his face, a tiny flinch he smothered with a fresh sob when he noticed the officer's eyes. It was one beat, maybe two, but in the ledger Horn kept in his head, beats mattered. "She's fighting," the EMT announced, as if speaking hope aloud might help it hold. Jimmy nodded too hard, wiped a dry face with the back of his hand, and asked, flatly, if he could grab another shirt. "Make it quick," Horn said, already stepping aside for the stretcher. When Jimmy returned, he dialed his daughter. "There's an emergency. Don't go anywhere. I'll talk to you in a little bit." He hung up and called his parents. The sobs erupted again, scraping the air but still not wetting his eyes. The stretcher left in a rush. The house went hollow. Horn and another officer continued their pass through the rooms, not rummaging, just looking for context. Family photos, 2 mugs in the sink, a cat blinking from beneath a chair. The ordinary life, intact enough to make what was happening feel like a misprint. "Did she say anything?" Horn asked. "No, nothing. We argued earlier at the bar. She walked home. I watched a movie upstairs, Ace Ventura. I went to check. Then I had to pick up our daughter. She was in the basement. I got her down, tried CPR, called." "Any history of this? Anything like this?" "Nothing. Never. We're healthy. We cook. We garden. She rock climbs with me. Everything was fine." Horn didn't argue. He didn't ask about the way Jimmy's composure clipped on and off, how his voice picked up theatrics when the room was full and dropped them when it wasn't. He didn't mention the ceiling or the way the cords in the corner seemed wrong in their placement, their purpose. He just kept the notes in his mind's quiet, along with the sound of the man's grief humming at a frequency that refused to ring true. By the time the EMTs cleared, the basement was a vacuum where a life had been. Horn stood at the foot of the stairs and looked up, measuring, estimating. He'd been in dozens of basements, laundry low, ducts lower, a place where the house's bones showed. This one felt shorter, 7 feet, he guessed. Amy had been 5'6". It wouldn't matter yet, might not matter at all, but the numbers landed somewhere behind his eyes and stayed. "We'll need to come back in the morning," Horn told Jimmy as they walked him to the porch. Rain fell in arranged lines. Blue strobes turned the wet street into a mirror. The neighbors' houses watched with slit windows. "Is she okay?" Jimmy asked, finally letting the question out. "Did they say?" "They said she had a pulse. They're working." The hospital was 2 minutes away. 2 minutes is a lifetime when someone you love is breathing and might stop. It's nothing when someone you love has already gone and you just don't know the time yet. Horn went home on autopilot and lay on his couch in the blue of his own television, the chip bowl scene looping in his head for reasons he refused to examine. After an hour, he gave up on sleep. He showered the basement dust off his arms, dressed again, and drove back just as dawn made a gray graphite of the street. Jimmy opened the door in a clean t-shirt, eyes red but still dry. He recited a timeline like a student who learned the wrong chapter by heart. Breakfast good, school drop-off ordinary, afternoon nap, dinner, football drop, 2 bars, an argument about moving south, her walking home, him driving. He laughed once, not at anything funny, just because sometimes a body forgets what to do with noise. "Can we have a look around?" Horn asked. "Just housekeeping." Jimmy nodded. "Take what you need." They moved room by room, respectful and quick, like guests late for a dinner they couldn't skip. The cat showed them the way, tail up, considering, and the house offered what houses always do, the character of its owners, the shape of their routine. Amy's laptop, her phone on the desk where a lamp cast a domestic halo, notes about groceries clipped to the fridge, spinach, seltzer, cat litter. In the basement, the light was merciless. Horn stood beneath the duct, reached up and touched the joist with his palm. 7 feet, maybe an inch. He looked at the extension cord looped over a pipe, at the scuff on the concrete where something had shifted, been dragged, or simply fallen. He crouched, placed 2 fingers on the scuff's edge, and felt the grit of disturbed dust. "See anything?" his partner asked. "Just the usual," Horn said. He glanced at the overturned litter bin, the way the granules had scattered in a fan shape, too neat to be panic, too messy to be accident. He took a photo. He took 10. And in each frame, the room told a slightly different story, none of them with a clean ending. By mid-morning, the house had been swallowed by the quiet again. Horn stepped outside to sign a form, and Jimmy followed, asking if there was any news from the hospital. Horn checked his phone, saw the message from the ER nurse, pulse weak, intubated, not responsive, and repeated the words as neutrally as rules demanded. Jimmy stared at the wet steps. He whispered, almost to himself, "I don't know what to do," then looked up and added, louder, "I'm hoping I wake up, dude. Get some rest. We'll be in touch." He didn't mean rest. He meant don't alter the scene. He meant don't leave town. He meant we will return with questions you can't answer cleanly. When Horn slid into his cruiser, the radio hissed and then delivered the sentence that rippled through him like cold. "They got a pulse. Patient is fighting. A fragile victory. Measured in minutes, then seconds." He put the car in drive, stopped and put it back in park. The house stood ahead of him, normal as a postcard. Vinyl siding, trimmed shrubs, the promise of a quiet life. He watched the front window and saw the man inside, pacing, phone to ear, then not, then folding a t-shirt he unfolded a moment later. In another hour, Horn would replay his body cam footage at his desk and pause on a frame no one else had noticed yet, his own hand brushing the joist on instinct, the camera tilting just enough to catch ceiling and cord in air in the same glance. He would freeze there and feel the room shrink.
He turned the key. The engine thrummed. The rain eased. Back at the station, in the stale coffee light of the report room, Horn began to write. He wrote the facts the way policy demanded: male caller, baseman, CPR, EMTs regained faint pulse. He wrote the details courts pretend not to need: erratic affect, dry eyes, bowl of chips, ceiling notably low. He wrote what could never count, and always does: something's off. When he finished, he added a line that would become a spine: recommend scene reconstruction, clearance for height replication in basement area. He saved the report and took a breath he didn't realize he'd been holding. The day stretched ahead, slow and heavy. The case would crawl through interviews and phone records and a search for motive that would thread its way from a bar argument to a glowing phone with a different name on it. But that was later. For now, Horn stared at the photo he'd taken of the scuff on the concrete and the lazy tumble of litter granules, and because he couldn't help himself, pictured how a body would hang in that room. When the lab finally rebuilt the basement at full scale and tightened the cord over the beam, they would measure the space between floor and heel and write the kind of sentence that changes everything. But that was ahead of them. At 11:07 a.m., the phone on Horn's desk chimed with a hospital update, flat words that made the room tilt. He read them twice, then grabbed his jacket. He was half out the door when the thought hit him with the neatness of a script. If this was what it looked like, the numbers wouldn't argue. And in that instant, the real cliff opened, sharp and quiet as a breath held too long. When they finally tested the basement height, the floor was closer than the story.
By morning, the rain had thinned to a mist that made the sidewalks look half erased. Officer Ben Horn walked back into the Allen house with a clipboard and a quiet apology for existing. He retraced his steps the way you retrace a dream. Same rooms, same angles, same shiver when the basement light snapped on. 7 feet. He didn't say it aloud, he just felt it in his shoulders. Jimmy gave a new version of calm, measured, explanatory, every sentence squared up like a presentation. Breakfast together, music in the kitchen, a quick nap, the drop-off at the high school game, 2 bars, a door he didn't mean to let close in her face, a walk home for her, a drive home for him, a movie upstairs to cool off, then the basement, then the call. "Any history?" Horn asked one more time. "Never," Jimmy said. "We're healthy, we're happy. This is not her." Horn nodded and wrote the word never without deciding what he believed. At the hospital, machines breathed for Amy. The faint mark at her neck looked like a whisper under the gauze. There were no defensive scrapes on Jimmy's arms, none of the frantic human evidence of 2 people fighting in a basement with a low ceiling and 1 exit. The ER notes called the mark faint, the pulse inconsistent, the prognosis a word no family wants to hear: uncertain. By afternoon, Amy's parents and siblings clustered in a circle at the station lobby, faces drawn into the same shape, loss before the official loss. They gave Horn the family history he didn't ask for and now couldn't ignore. A son named Caleb, raised partly by grandparents, a controlling husband who measured the house's moods like he measured the cat's kibble, a list of small rules that, laid end to end, reached the door and barred it. He cut her off, one said, from us, from friends, from everything. He tracked her, where she was, what she did. Horn listened, took notes, and kept the worst thought to himself. Control doesn't prove murder any more than grief proves innocence. He could not build a case on stories alone. He needed measurements, logs, towers pinging emptily into the night. He needed a room rebuilt to scale. 3 days later, Amy was taken off life support. The call came and Horn sat very still, as if remaining in place would keep the words from catching up to him. He thought about the bowl of chips. He hated himself for thinking about the bowl of chips. Detective Larry Rothman from the state police took the case like someone laying a clean sheet over a messy table. He watched every second of body cam footage until the basement filled his head and pushed sleep aside. When he saw Horn brush the joist as casually as a man swatting a fly, he paused and rewound. If the room was really 7 feet, a body of Amy's height couldn't hang without a bend that left evidence somewhere. On the floor, the toes, the cord, the skin. "Let's rebuild it," he said. "No assumptions, just math." While engineers measured and replicated the space, Rothman mapped the hours no one could explain. The bar cameras showed Amy leaving alone at 7:58 p.m., shoulders squared, phone bright in her hand. A second angle caught Jimmy a minute later, jaw clenched, eyes not on the door but on his reflection as he passed. The gap between them, 60 seconds, and a story. Phone records filled with static and certainty. Ashley's number at 8:59, the parents at 9:01, the 911 call at 8:52, the movie searches before that, as if flicking through comedies could paper over what a basement remembers. In Amy's messages, an entire other life bloomed. A man named George, texts that pulsed with the kind of warmth you don't admit when you're pretending to be fine. "I love you. I want more of you. End of October. Let's do it." Rothman didn't write motive in his notes. He wrote pressure. He wrote secrets with clocks on them. Jimmy, meanwhile, left Michigan with his daughter and 5 cats, drove 1,000 quiet miles to Ocala, Florida, and sat in his parents' house staring at a lake he used to fish when the world felt less complicated. He picked up when Rothman called. He sounded grateful for any voice that wasn't his. "I'll come back up," he said. "I need to grab a few things. Let's talk when you do. Clear the air." A month after the basement, Jimmy sat in an interview room and unspooled a careful version of himself. He was a type A. He liked structure, improvement, discipline, mental fitness. He wanted the best for everyone. Sometimes that meant standards others misunderstood. He talked about Amy's shyness, her anxiety, the video games he'd nudged her away from, the rock climbing she'd taken to, the life he'd built like a straight path. He called his control love without using the word. "Do you think she was unfaithful?" Rothman asked, knowing the answer and how it would land. "I don't think that would be possible," Jimmy said. "She didn't have the capacity." Rothman slid printed chat excerpts across the table. The words lifted off the page like heat. "I love you, too. I'm ready to spend time with you in person." Jimmy stared. The first crack was small, then another. He laughed once without air. "I still don't believe it. I'm sorry, I don't believe it." He agreed to a polygraph because sometimes saying yes feels like proof you're telling the truth. The results were mud, inconclusive, a word that sounds like a door neither open nor shut. 3 months in, the medical examiner called. The cause of death, strangulation, asphyxiation. The manner, undetermined. Rothman read the sentence 3 times, then printed it and underlined the word that mattered, undetermined. He needed the basement to speak louder. The engineers finished their reconstruction in a white room full of neutral light. They built the ceiling to the fraction, fixed a beam where Horn's hand had hovered, tied an extension cord looped just as it had been looped. They hung a weighted form to Amy's height and watched the line the feet made with the floor. There was no dramatic drop. There was contact. You could not suspend that weight without either moving the anchor point or curling a body into geometry the scene didn't support. A second pathologist reviewed the modeling, the mark, the lack of petechia, the absence of defensive injuries on the person who said he found her, the room, the numbers. He wrote it plainly, homicide. Rothman sat with the report and didn't move. In his head, he walked the house again, touched the joist, saw the scatter of litter. He imagined a fight that wasn't a fight, anger compressed into a grip, a quiet room where the ceiling made a certain lie impossible. He called the prosecutor's office. They talked in polite, professional phrases that barely concealed relief. The case was no longer a shape in fog. It took time to build the paperwork. Warrants are slow by design. Justice dislikes impulse.
While they waited, Rothman chased down the rest, because thoroughness is the only way to sleep at night. He watched security footage from JR's that showed Amy turning on her heel and heading into the dark with the certainty you earn. He zoomed a frame to see the band of a ring, familiar and plain, tap the bar. He read a statement from a hospital staffer who'd first seen Amy. No visible injuries inconsistent with hanging, red flag. He listened to Caleb describe a teenage night when discipline crossed into something that left him gasping, a memory that had never stopped grabbing his throat. He listened to neighbors say the house was louder than usual and then too quiet. Then near midnight on a Thursday in October, Rothman received a piece of news that didn't fit neatly into any form. In Florida, Jimmy was engaged. The wedding was 5 days away.
He pictured the lake where the photos would be taken, the suit hung from a door, the way a new ring would shine under a different sky. He thought of a sentence from a report. He cooperated with police throughout the 2-year investigation. He pictured cooperation as a day-long mask. The judge signed the warrant the following morning. Papers left printers in a small storm. Extradition was a word you say softly when families are nearby. Rothman called Horn because you call the man who first felt the ceiling with his palm. "You were right about the numbers," Rothman said. Horn didn't say, "I wish I wasn't." He stared at the photo of the scuff on the concrete and the lazy scatter of litter and said, "What time?" "Soon," Rothman replied, "before vows." In Ocala, a doorbell would ring and a quiet house would fill with the measured noise of law. Somewhere between the knock and the cuffs, someone would ask a question that wasn't really a question. "This is how you sleep at night?" And Jimmy would answer with something that sounded like confusion, like disbelief, like a man who'd learned to narrate a life into the version he could stand. In Michigan, the lake effect sky rolled a new sheet of gray over the high school football field. Horn drove past the stadium and thought about the girl in the bleachers who left with a friend and came home to a world rearranged. He turned back toward the station, toward the lab report that said the thing that would never not matter. When the arrest team in Florida stepped through the door, the living room tableau froze. A suit jacket on a chair back, a cat threading the officer's ankles, a woman's hand flying to her mouth. A phone buzzed on the coffee table and lit up with a calendar reminder. Rehearsal, 3 p.m. Across town, a clerk at the courthouse stamped the charge. Open murder. Rothman's phone lit. He answered without hello. "We have him," the sergeant said. He asked one thing. "What?" He asked if he could keep the ring on a minute longer. Rothman closed his eyes. He pictured a basement where numbers refused to lie, a ceiling too low for a story to stand. "Book him," he said. They did, and while the chain of custody clicked into place, a printer at the jail slid out a single sheet of paper that fell face up on a metal desk. The line at the top read, "Arraignment pending." The line at the bottom read, "Bond, $10 million." The sergeant set a pen on the form and turned toward the camera for intake. Jimmy looked into the lens with the practiced expression of a man who believes he can still imagine his way out. That afternoon, as the engineers broke down the mock basement beam, one of them found a small smear of chalk on his glove from where he'd marked a measurement. He rubbed his thumb over it, leaving a gray crescent that wouldn't quite wipe off. He tried again. It stayed.
The courtroom was colder than it needed to be. Michigan autumns were already cruel, but the air inside the county courthouse felt engineered to remind everyone that warmth was for the innocent. Jimmy Allen sat at the defense table, jaw tight, the gray suit too crisp for a man who claimed to be broken. The prosecutor's voice was even, careful. "Ladies and gentlemen of the jury, you will hear about a ceiling too low, a cord too short, and a man who believed his wife didn't have the capacity to defy him." Jimmy didn't flinch. He had spent 3 years perfecting stillness, the kind that passes for discipline when it's really fear. Across the aisle sat Amy's parents, their faces hollowed by months of hearings. Behind them, Detective Larry Rothman waited with his notes, the weight of a basement beam still in his spine. Officer Horn wasn't far away. He'd been subpoenaed for testimony, but truthfully, he came because cases like this don't end, they just echo. The first witness was Caleb, Amy's son from before Jimmy. Older now, hands folded, voice steady until it wasn't. He told the jury about the night years ago when a disagreement had turned into something darker. "I stood up to him," he said, "and he came from behind, choked me until I couldn't breathe." He paused, the word choked catching like a splinter in the room. Next came the hospital nurse who had first seen Amy that night. "No visible injuries consistent with hanging," she said. "That was a red flag." A forensic engineer followed. The ceiling height was measured at approximately 7 feet. The decedent's height was 5 feet 6 inches. Under these conditions, suspension without contact between the feet and the floor would not have been physically possible. In plain English, she couldn't have hung herself. Each word folded the room in tighter silence. The juror scribbled notes. Jimmy's eyes flicked to his attorney, then to the floor. The defense did what defenses do. They painted a parallel story. Amy, they said, had been troubled, prone to drinking, anxious, fragile. They brought up the affair, the late-night messages with George. They called it a fantasy, a brief escape for a woman overwhelmed by guilt. They called Jimmy patient, structured, loving. But the prosecution had the data. The text pings showing Amy's phone still active after Jimmy claimed he'd been upstairs watching Ace Ventura. The timestamp on the 911 call that didn't fit with the timeline of his discovery. The search history that included how long CPR before help arrives and asphyxiation timeline, both typed hours before the call. They didn't need to prove rage. They only had to prove that the story didn't fit inside the basement. Detective Rothman took the stand. He didn't dramatize. He didn't have to. He said, "When we reconstructed the scene, we tested the extension cord and ceiling joist with a weighted form. Under equivalent conditions, the subject's feet touched the ground. The marks on her neck aligned with a front-to-back grip, not vertical pressure. That's not suspension, that's compression." "Meaning?" the prosecutor asked. "Meaning someone's hands were there." The phrase hung longer than any silence could. Jimmy shifted in his chair. Not a big move, just enough for the microphone to catch the scrape of fabric. His daughter Ashley, sitting behind him, closed her eyes. After 6 hours, the jury returned. Second-degree murder. The judge read it slowly, syllables spaced like hammer strikes. Jimmy didn't shout, he didn't cry. He only looked toward the floor, as if the old basement were still beneath his feet, that same 7 feet of air that had betrayed his story. When they cuffed him, his voice was low, almost gentle. "She wasn't supposed to," but the sentence never found an ending. Outside the courthouse, the world resumed. Reporters packed up, cars moved again. Somewhere, the lake near their old house carried its quiet like an oath. Rothman stayed behind, watching the crowd disperse. Horn joined him, hands in pockets. "Funny thing about numbers," Horn said. "They don't lie. No, but people sure try to make them." They both looked down the courthouse steps, where the van waited with its door open, the same gray van that had ferried hundreds before Jimmy and would ferry hundreds after. The last sound the detectives heard was the metallic click of that door closing. Sharp, final, like a nail sealing the floorboards over a basement where everything had started. They thought the truth ended there. But 3 months later, during a standard audit, a clerk at the evidence storage facility noticed an error in the property log. A single envelope misfiled under domestic disturbance, Allen. Inside was a flash drive labeled JR's Security Backlog, 0914.
It contained footage from the bar's parking lot that night. Jimmy wasn't alone when he left. And that, they'd soon realize, was the part of the story no one had asked the right question about. If you thought this one was wild, wait for the next. Hit subscribe before the truth disappears.